I have 1,142 friends. At least that's what my Facebook page tells me this week. Although if I'm honest with you, I don't know half of them. In fact, I get so many friend requests from people I've never met, I've had to change my criteria for friendship these days. It used to be whether or not I knew you or whether or not I wanted to know you. Now it's simply how many mutual friends on Facebook we have, which I'm reminded of when I scroll through my feed these days. While the intent of social media, at least in part, is to keep up with friends all over the world, I end up discovering what complete strangers are doing on their vacations, or where people I barely know are at dinner for that night, or how little I have in common with people with whom I apparently have 100 mutual friends. Don't get me wrong, I see the value in technology and the ways in which it keeps us connected today. Although despite these connections, a recent Cigna study places loneliness at the root of an emerging health crisis. According to the study, 27% of Americans rarely or never feel understood, while 2 in 5 or always feeling their relationships are not meaningful. One meta-analysis of the study suggests that loneliness increases our odds of dying early by 45%. Robert Wuthnow refers to this as loose connections. He suggests the bonds that hold everything together these days, groups and organizations and families and friendships, that they're all tenuous at best anymore. He writes, today, more so than ever, children live in fear of divorce, as do their parents. Grandparents fear the future and if they'll be abandoned. Suicide is the second highest cause of death among teens. And the fastest growing category of households is one-member households. We've never been lonelier than we are today. I suppose it should be no surprise then that not long ago they padded the lampposts in London's East End. I wonder if you heard about this. Apparently a survey revealed that 1 in 10 people were harmed by focusing on their cell phones instead of where they were walking. And so they've designed new lampposts to protect those who are walking down the sidewalks not paying attention from banging into the lampposts. Yes, you heard me right. They're padding the lampposts. It's no wonder we're more divided than we've ever been before. After all, we're more present to almost anything else than we are to one another. Which got me thinking about how separated the characters are in our reading from Luke this morning. Specifically these main characters, Jesus, the centurion, and this slave who's healed. Unlike other healing stories in the Gospels, Jesus never actually meets the person he heals, nor even the person making the request. No, if you remember, all the communication happens between these intermediaries. At first it's the town elders, and then the friends of this centurion. Of course, there are all these social divisions too. You find them throughout the story. The centurion's a soldier in an occupying army. He's also a Gentile in the land of the Jews. Not to mention he's a man of power and wealth in a place where few possess either. No matter how highly we, or Jesus for that matter, might think of this centurion, he still owns slaves, including the one Jesus heals. And yet despite all of these divisions, all the ways in which the people of Capernaum are separated, it's the physical presence of a few who hold things together for this community. It's the advocacy of a few friends who make this healing possible. Associate Professor of Spirituality at Duke Divinity School, Lauren Winner, recently wrote a book entitled Still, Notes on a Mid-Faith Crisis. In it, she details a very personal memoir in which she loses hope in everyone and everything, including God, as a result of the death of her mother after a horrible illness and a subsequent divorce from her spouse of many, many years. In an interview with Relevant Magazine recently, Winter was asked, "So then, how are you still a Christian? I mean, without your beliefs, why do you still identify in that way?" To which she replies, "I'm a Christian because a group of people showed up constantly and consistently to pray with and for me when I did not find the words. They were there for me when I could not be there for myself." I don't know, maybe everything would have been the same for the village of Capernaum that day had Jesus showed up and done the healing himself. Or perhaps the community would have had the same results had Jesus responded by text or email or phone call. It's just that I don't know about you, but it's certainly not the same for me. I mean, isn't there a difference between a friend showing up to your hospital room and receiving a text message of well wishes? Or getting a meal from a congregant at your home than by way of a stranger via DoorDash? Or having a conversation over a cup of coffee than a lengthy exchange by email? Judy Edwards, one of our longtime members here, shared with me a story recently about being in Japan for a year during her earlier days counseling Japanese women. She had a counseling relationship with one woman in particular that lasted the entirety of that year. Not long before Judy moved back to the States, the woman walked in, sat down in Judy's office, and in broken English said something like, "Thank you. Thank you. I just want you to know that you've cured me." Judy said to me, "If I'm honest, I'm not sure what I did. I mean, I never could figure out that woman's problems. After all, I never understood a word she said." It's funny, and yet it's so true, isn't it? That there's something unique about the power of presence. Something technology just cannot do. Even if we aren't able to understand each other, simply being with one another, it makes a difference. Or at least that's what study after study reveals. That we're not made to sit behind screens, but rather to socially interact with one another. We're not created only to share our thoughts and feelings on social media, but rather to laugh together and to cry together. No, we were made for physical contact. We were made for community. I'm not saying relationships can't be had from a distance. I'm just saying the most meaningful relationships in my life are those by which I've had and been changed because someone showed up for me. In fact, Judy admitted the same. She said, "The truth is, I learned a lot more from the one I was so-called counseling than she ever learned from me." I know that most who read this story want to point out the faith of the centurion in this text. After all, Jesus certainly does. But I can't help but wonder if it's not so much the centurion's faith in Jesus as it is the centurion's faith in his friends with which Jesus is most impressed. I tell you, not even in Israel have I seen such faith, Jesus says. Maybe he's talking about kind and not degree. Not that the relationships in this story are perfect. No, we've already established they're far from it. But But what makes this story different is that it's not Jesus, but a small group of friends who changed the life of not only the one in the need, but the entire community. After all, the village of Capernaum learned that day that they did not need Jesus to come back. They needed to be there for one another. Which might sound overly simplistic, but is a desperately needed message for the church today, isn't it? Just watch the evening news. Clergy abuse scandals, arguments about the role of women in the church, votes being taken to exclude the LGBTQ community. It's no wonder the group of people in this country who consider themselves non-religious or unaffiliated has grown to be as large today as Catholics and evangelicals. And yet, that's not the whole story, is it? In fact, I see elders and friends going to Jesus on behalf of those in need every day in this congregation. Of course, those stories don't make the news, but that doesn't mean they're not significantly impacting the world. Like the individual who's carpooling a group of you this next week, a great distance, to see a church member who, for health reasons, can no longer be with us in worship. Or the people who are navigating the privacy of a family going through challenging times while ensuring this family has meals in the refrigerator every week. Or the family who's making it possible for a family in need to have financial security for the next year. Look, I realize we may not eradicate racism or sexism or poverty overnight. But despite our imperfections, when the church shows up, we have the power, God's power, to change hearts and minds. When we are, as Dr. King puts it, the beloved community, we model for the world that it's possible. And it happens one person, one situation, one circumstance at a time. The late, great Fred Craddock told a story about his father. I thought I'd share on Father's Day. I think gets to this end. He said, my father thought the church was just about another name and another pledge. When the pastor used to come from my mother's church to call on him, my father would say, you don't care about me. I know how churches are. You just want another name, another pledge, right? Another name, another pledge. Isn't that the whole point of the church, is to get another name, another pledge? When we had an evangelistic campaign, the pastor would bring the evangelist to introduce him to my father and then say, sick him, get him, sick him. My father would always say the same thing. You don't care about me. Another name, another pledge. I know about churches. I guess I heard it 1,000 times. There was one time, though, I didn't hear it. He was at the Veterans Hospital, was down to about 74 pounds. They'd taken out his throat and put in a metal tube. Said, Mr. Craddock, you should have come earlier. This cancer is awfully far advanced. I went to see him. And when I walked in every window, there were potted plants and flowers. Everywhere there was a place to set them, potted plants and flowers. Even on that thing that swings across the bed to put the food, there was a flower there. There by his bed was a stack of cards 10 to 15 inches deep. I looked at the cards sprinkled on the flowers. I read the cards beside his bed, and I want to tell you, every card, every blossom, every potted plant were from groups at my mother's church. Sunday school classes, women's groups, youth groups, men's Bible class. Every one of them. There's even a church member sitting in that room when I came in that day, sitting with my mother. My father saw me reading his cards. He couldn't speak, but he took a Kleenex box and wrote something on the side from Shakespeare's Hamlet. He wrote, "In this harsh world, draw your breath in pain to tell my story." I said, "Daddy, what is your story?" And he wrote, "I was wrong.